She bought an abandoned church for 12 cents at a county auction where dozens of developers and investors stood watching her bid. Yet not a single person raised their hand to challenge her, as if they knew something about that crumbling stone building that would make any sane person walk away. Marianne Delacroix looked around the crowd assembled in the town square of Thornefield, Vermont, expecting someone to outbid her. The Church of Saint Aurelius sat on nearly 2 acres of land in the historic district, and even in its deteriorated state, the property should have been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The location alone, prime real estate in a tourist town famous for its autumn foliage and colonial architecture, made it a developer's dream. But the silence that followed her bid felt heavy, oppressive, unnatural. "Going once?" the auctioneer called, his voice lacking the enthusiasm she'd heard when he'd sold the previous properties. Marianne noticed the man's eyes kept darting to someone standing in the back of the crowd, as if seeking permission or guidance on whether to continue. The strangest part wasn't just that nobody bid against her. It was the way people were looking at her. Not with jealousy or frustration at losing what should have been an incredible deal, but with something that made her skin crawl and her stomach turn. Pity mixed with fear, as if she'd just volunteered for something terrible instead of making a smart real estate investment. Marianne had been flipping properties for 3 years now, ever since her divorce had forced her to rebuild her life from scratch. She'd developed an eye for distressed properties with hidden potential, and she'd learned to trust her instincts. But right now, every instinct was screaming that something was very, very wrong. Going twice. An elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun pushed through the crowd toward her. She moved with surprising speed for someone who had to be in her 70s, and her weathered hands gripped a worn leather handbag like it was a shield. Her name badge read, Dr. Constance Whitmore, Thornefield Historical Preservation Society. "Young woman," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling as she gripped Marianne's arm with surprising strength. Her fingers felt cold even through the fabric of Marianne's jacket. "You don't want that church. Please, I'm begging you, trust me on this. Walk away while you still can." Before Marianne could ask why, before she could demand an explanation for the cryptic warning, the gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings louder and longer than it should have. The sound made several people in the crowd actually flinch. "Sold to the woman in the blue jacket for 12 cents. 12 cents. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The crowd began to disperse immediately, people walking away faster than normal, as if eager to distance themselves from what had just happened. Some practically fled to their cars. Others ducked into nearby shops. But nobody congratulated her on her purchase. Nobody approached to discuss the property or make a competing offer now that the auction was over. As Marianne approached the auctioneer's table to complete her paperwork and collect her deed, she overheard fragments of hushed conversations drifting on the autumn wind. "Should have warned her properly. Nobody's been inside since Sister Evangeline. What happened to those historical society researchers who went exploring 5 years ago? The Whitmore family has been trying to keep people out for decades. She'll find out soon enough why nobody else bid." The auctioneer, a thin man in his 50s with nervous hands that wouldn't stop trembling, handed her the deed with his fingers shaking so badly he nearly dropped the document. When Marianne asked about the church's history, about why such a valuable property had sold for essentially nothing, the man simply shook his head and began packing up his papers without another word. He wouldn't even look at her. "Please," Marianne pressed. "I need to know what I'm getting into here. Why did nobody else bid?" The auctioneer paused, his hands still for just a moment. "Ma'am, I've been running property auctions in this county for 23 years. I've seen a lot of strange things, but I've never seen anything like what happened with that church. My advice? Sell it tomorrow to whoever offers to buy it. Take your profit and don't ask questions." "But that's all I can tell you." He snapped his briefcase shut and walked away quickly, leaving Marianne standing alone by the auction table. That's when she noticed the most disturbing detail of all. Every single person who had attended the auction was now watching her from various distances, standing by their cars but not getting in, lingering in shop doorways but not entering, peering from cafe windows with their coffee growing cold. They weren't leaving. They were waiting, watching to see what she would do next. as if they expected something specific to happen. Something that had happened before. Dr. Constance Whitmore stood apart from the others, her expression a mixture of sadness and fear. When their eyes met across the square, the old woman shook her head slowly, then turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Marianne felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the crisp October air. The drive to Saint Aurelius. The drive to the Church of Saint Aurelius felt longer than the actual 20-minute journey from Thornefield's town square. Marianne couldn't shake the weight of those watching eyes, the whispered warnings, the fear she'd seen on Dr. Whitmore's face. The old woman hadn't just been concerned. She'd been genuinely terrified. But 12 cents for 2 acres of prime real estate in Vermont's most desirable historic district was still 12 cents for 2 acres of prime real estate. Even if the building needed extensive repairs, the land value alone should have been worth hundreds of thousands. Marianne had checked the property records that morning. The church sat in a zone that allowed for commercial development, mixed-use conversion, or residential subdivision. It made no financial sense for the property to sell for 12 cents. Unless nobody wanted it for reasons that had nothing to do with zoning or development potential. The access road to St. Aurelius wound through dense forest that had already begun its autumn transformation. Brilliant reds, oranges, and gold surrounded her car as she drove, creating a tunnel of color that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But now, with the afternoon sun creating long shadows across the road, it felt ominous, oppressive. The church appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, and Marianne's breath caught in her throat. The Church of Saint Aurelius had been built in 1842, a Gothic revival structure that must have been breathtaking in its prime. The bell tower still reached toward the sky despite missing several stones from its spire, and the main building stretched back farther than she'd expected, at least 80 feet from the entrance to what she assumed was the sanctuary and altar area. The stone walls were constructed of local granite, now covered in thick ivy that had claimed much of the structure as its own. Most of the stained glass windows were either broken or boarded up with weathered plywood that suggested years of neglect. But despite the obvious deterioration, the bones were magnificent. Flying buttresses supported the main walls, and intricate stone carvings depicting angels, saints, and biblical scenes adorned the archways and decorative elements. Someone had spent years creating this building, pouring craft and devotion into every detail. Marianne parked her car in what had once been a gravel parking lot, now overgrown with weeds and small saplings. She grabbed her camera, flashlight, and the leather notebook where she documented all her property acquisitions. The autumn air smelled of dead leaves and damp stone. As she approached the heavy wooden double doors at the entrance, she noticed something that made her pause. A rusted chain had been wrapped around the door handles, but the padlock hung open, dangling uselessly. The chain itself looked old, but the lock's position suggested someone had opened it recently and simply left it hanging there. Someone had been here recently. Marianne's hand moved to her phone, finger hovering over the emergency call button. But she was a professional property investor, not a scared child. She'd explored dozens of abandoned buildings in her 3 years of business. This was no different, except it was different, and she knew it. The doors swung inward with a low groan that echoed through the empty interior. The sound seemed to go on forever, reverberating and multiplying until it sounded less like a door opening and more like something waking up. Inside St. Aurelius. The interior of the Church of Saint Aurelius took Marianne's breath away. Afternoon light streamed through gaps in the boarded windows, creating dramatic columns of dust-filled illumination that cut through the darkness like spotlights. The nave stretched before her, lined with wooden pews that sat in crooked rows, many of them damaged or overturned, but some still standing perfectly straight as if waiting for a congregation that would never return. The vaulted ceiling soared overhead, easily 40 feet high at its peak, with exposed wooden beams that had somehow survived decades of abandonment. At the far end of the nave, elevated on a platform of stone steps, the altar still stood beneath a large wooden cross. Even from the entrance, Marianne could see the altar cloth was still in place, faded and moth-eaten but present. But it was the smell that struck her first. Not the musty dampness and rot she'd expected from a building abandoned for decades, but something else entirely. Fresh air, crisp and cold, as if the building had been ventilated recently despite its apparent abandonment. There was also a faint scent of stone dust, as if someone had been doing construction or excavation work. Her footsteps echoed on the stone floor as she walked slowly down the center aisle, her camera documenting everything. The acoustics were remarkable, every sound amplified and distorted by the empty space. Each footfall seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The pews closest to the altar showed signs of recent disturbance, dust patterns disrupted, footprints in the grime that accumulated on the floor. Someone had definitely been here and not long ago. Behind the altar, she discovered something that made her stop and kneel for a closer look. The floor stones in that area were worn smooth, much smoother than the rest of the church, as if countless feet had passed over them for decades or even centuries. But more than that, one rectangular section of stones didn't quite match the others. Slightly different color, slightly different texture, set in a deliberate pattern that seemed purposeful rather than decorative or random. Marianne ran her fingers along the seams between the stones. They'd been mortared recently, within the last few years, judging by the condition of the material. The mortar was different from what held the surrounding stones, newer, stronger, applied by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone had gone to considerable effort to seal this particular section of floor. The question was, why? A sound from outside made her freeze, every muscle tensing. Footsteps on gravel, deliberate and slow, circling the building. Not trying to be quiet, but not rushing either. Someone walking with purpose, someone who had every right to be there. Or someone who didn't care if they were heard. Marianne moved quietly to one of the broken windows and peered out carefully, staying in the shadows. A figure stood near the tree line, partially obscured by the low-hanging branches of an ancient oak. Even from this distance, she could see the person wore a dark coat and had positioned themselves to have a clear view of the church entrance and her parked car. Someone was keeping watch. Had been watching, probably for years. When Marianne's eyes met the watchers through the broken glass, she expected the person to flee, to disappear into the forest to avoid identification. Instead, they simply turned and walked deeper into the trees with measured, unhurried steps, disappearing from view as if they had all the time in the world. But they'd made their point. Marianne was being watched. Someone knew she was here, knew she'd bought the church, and wanted her to know they were keeping an eye on things. The message was clear: you're not alone here. The Historical Society. Marianne decided she needed answers before going any further. If something was hidden beneath those floor stones, if someone was actively watching the property, she needed to understand what she'd gotten herself into. The 12-cent purchase price suddenly felt less like a bargain and more like a trap. The Thornefield Historical Preservation Society occupied a beautiful Victorian building on Main Street, painted in the traditional purple and cream colors that marked it as one of the town's protected historic structures. Through the tall windows, Marianne could see shelves lined with books, filing cabinets, and walls covered with old photographs and maps. Dr. Constance Whitmore sat at an antique desk in the corner when Marianne walked in. The old woman's expression shifted from surprise to resignation when she saw who had entered, as if she'd been expecting this visit but had hoped it wouldn't come. "I hoped you'd change your mind and leave," Dr. Whitmore said quietly, closing the leather-bound journal she'd been reading. "I hoped you'd sell the property site unseen and move on with your life." "I need to know what's going on," Marianne said firmly, pulling up a chair without waiting for an invitation. "Why did you try to stop me from buying that church? Why did nobody else bid? And why is someone watching the property right now?" Dr. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, her pale blue eyes sharp despite her age. Finally, she sighed deeply and gestured to the chair Marianne had already claimed. "How much do you know about Saint Aurelius's history?" "Just what I could find in the public records. Built in 1842, served the community for over 150 years. Abandoned in 1998. "It wasn't abandoned," Dr. Whitmore corrected, her voice sharp. "It was sealed, closed, locked away deliberately. There's a significant difference, Ms. Delacroix." She pulled out a worn folder from a locked drawer and placed it on the desk between them. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes in multiple different hands, as if generations of researchers had contributed to the collection. Saint Aurelius served the community for 156 years. Dr. Whitmore began, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who'd told this story before. But in 1989, something happened that the diocese tried very hard to keep quiet. Sister Evangeline Moreau, who had served as the church's caretaker and archivist for 30 years, disappeared. Just vanished one autumn night without a trace. She showed Marianne a newspaper clipping from October 1989. Local nun missing, authorities investigating. The photograph showed a kind-faced woman in her 60s, wearing traditional nun's attire, standing in front of Saint Aurelius. Her smile was warm, but her eyes held an intensity that came through even in the faded newspaper print. "They never found her?" Marianne asked. "They found her rosary and her reading glasses on the altar, as if she'd simply stepped out of her clothing and vanished into thin air. But Sister Evangeline herself was never seen again. The official story was that she'd left the order and moved away, but those of us who knew her understood that was impossible. She devoted her entire life to that church and to the community." Dr. Whitmore pulled out another document, a letter written in elegant, old-fashioned cursive handwriting on stationery that had yellowed with age. This was written by Sister Evangeline's assistant, a young woman named Claire Beaumont who worked with her on church archives. "Claire gave this letter to my predecessor at the Historical Society before she left Thornefield in 1990. She said it was important that someone know the truth, even if that truth could never be spoken publicly." Marianne read the letter carefully, her hands beginning to tremble as she absorbed the contents. Claire Beaumont described how Sister Evangeline had become obsessed with the church basement in the months before her disappearance. She spent hours down there, often emerging covered in dust and stone chips, her hands scraped and bleeding from moving stones. When Claire asked what she was doing, Sister Evangeline would only say she was investigating the foundations and following a trail that's been hidden for centuries. Claire had overheard Sister Evangeline speaking on the phone. This was before cell phones were common, so she'd been using the church's landline to someone about documents that could reshape our understanding of colonial history and evidence that powerful families have been hiding for generations. The letter described Sister Evangeline's growing paranoia. She became convinced someone was watching the church. She started sleeping in the sanctuary instead of going home. She told Claire that she'd discovered something extraordinary beneath the altar, something that certain people would kill to keep buried. 3 days before she vanished, Claire found Sister Evangeline sealing the basement entrance with fresh mortar, working late into the night by lantern light. When Claire demanded to know what was happening, Sister Evangeline had said something that Claire never forgot. "Some secrets are too dangerous to unearth, but too important to destroy. I'm making sure they stay exactly where they are until the right time comes, until someone brave enough and foolish enough finds them and knows what to do." That was the last conversation they'd had. 3 days later, Sister Evangeline was gone. The diocese sent investigators. Dr. Whitmore continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. Church officials, police, even though this was never publicly confirmed, someone from the State Department. They sealed the church completely in 1990, claiming structural damage made it unsafe. But that wasn't the real reason. They were making sure nobody could access whatever Sister Evangeline had found. What did she find? Marianne asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Dr. Whitmore shook her head slowly. Nobody knows for certain. The official records were sealed or destroyed. But there are rumors, old rumors that go back much farther than Saint Aurelius, much farther than Thornefield itself. She pulled out a final document, a map that looked ancient, drawn on parchment that had been carefully preserved under glass. The date in the corner read 1744. This was surveyed by a French exploration team 30 years before the American Revolution. See this marking? She pointed to a symbol on the map, a circle with a cross inside it and what looked like stairs or steps descending below the cross. That's the location where Saint Aurelius now stands. The French notation beside it translates to La Crypte de Pères Perdus, the crypt of the lost fathers. Marianne felt her skin prickle with goosebumps. What does that mean? Who were the lost fathers? That's the question, isn't it? The French explorers found something here in 1744, almost a century before Saint Aurelius was built. Whatever they discovered, they marked it on their maps but didn't elaborate. The next mention comes from colonial records in 1768, where a British surveyor named Thomas Ashford noted ancient stone works of unknown origin at this location. Dr. Whitmore paused, her expression growing darker. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. In 1842, when they were preparing to build St. Aurelius, construction workers discovered an entrance to something underground. The church was built quite deliberately over that entrance, incorporating it into the structure. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. They built a church on top of something they wanted to hide, Marianne said slowly, the implications beginning to dawn on her. Or something they wanted to seal away. There's a difference between hiding something and containing it. Before Marianne could ask what that meant, Dr. Whitmore pulled out a more recent document, a police report from 2018. 6 years ago, 3 researchers from the New England Historical Archives Project decided to explore St. Aurelius for a documentary about abandoned religious structures. They had full permission from the diocese, proper legal clearance, insurance, professional equipment, everything legitimate and above board. What happened to them? Dr. Whitmore's hands trembled as she opened the police report. They entered the church at 2 p.m. on an October afternoon, much like today. By 8 p.m., when they hadn't emerged or responded to calls, their support team contacted authorities. Police and emergency services went in to find them. She pushed the report toward Marianne. All 3 researchers were found unconscious in the nave, arranged in a circle around the altar. Their equipment had been smashed, cameras destroyed, recording devices shattered, their research notes scattered and torn. When they regained consciousness in the hospital 2 days later, none of them remembered what had happened. They had no memory of anything after descending beneath the altar. Descended? So there is something under there. According to their initial radio communications before they lost consciousness, yes. They'd discovered an entrance beneath the sealed floor stones, a stairway descending into bedrock. They'd gone down approximately 40 steps before their communications cut off. Whatever they found down there, it was enough to make them lose consciousness and destroy their own equipment. Dr. Whitmore closed the file carefully. After that incident, the diocese finally gave up trying to maintain control of the property. They put it up for auction with a reserve price so astronomically high that nobody would ever buy it. They've been holding the same auction every year for the past 6 years, always setting the minimum bid at $500,000. Until this year, Marianne said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. This year they set it at 12 cents. Which means, Dr. Whitmore said, her pale eyes locked on Marianne's, either someone finally convinced the diocese to let it go, or someone with enough power to manipulate a church auction wanted that property opened legally. And they wanted someone like you. Someone with no connection to Thornefield, no knowledge of the history, no reason to refuse, to be the one who owned it. Marianne thought about the watcher in the woods, the way the auctioneer had kept looking to someone in the back of the crowd, the recently opened padlock on the church doors. Someone's been going in there, she said. The chain was already unlocked when I arrived. Dr. Whitmore's face went pale. Then you need to be very, very careful, Ms. Delacroix, because if someone is willing to wait decades, manipulate church auctions, and guard that property for years just to get it open legally, they're not going to let you walk away now that you own it. You have something they need, legal access. You're the key that opens the door they've been waiting to open for a very long time. What should I do? Sell it. Tomorrow. Take whatever profit you can get and leave Thornefield. Forget you ever heard of St. Aurelius. But even as Dr. Whitmore said the words, both women knew it was already too late for that. Marianne had seen too much, knew too much. Whatever was beneath that church, whatever Sister Evangeline had sealed away 35 years ago, Marianne was now inextricably connected to it. The question was no longer whether she should investigate. The question was whether she'd survive what she found. Return to St. Aurelius. Marianne returned to the Church of Saint Aurelius as evening approached. But this time she came prepared. 3 high-powered LED flashlights, a crowbar she'd purchased at the hardware store, her phone fully charged and set to automatically back up photos to the cloud, and a very clear plan to document everything she found before making any decisions about what to do with the property. She'd also sent an email to her lawyer with the address and a note that if she didn't check in by 9 p.m., he should contact the police. It wasn't much protection, but it was something. The church felt different in the fading light. Long shadows stretched across the nave like grasping fingers reaching toward her, and the columns of dusty sunlight that had seemed almost mystical that afternoon now looked ominous, as if they were spotlights searching for something. The temperature inside seemed to have dropped 10 degrees, and Marianne's breath made small clouds in the cold air. But she pushed past her unease and headed straight for the altar, her footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. The sealed section of floor stones required more effort than she'd expected to open. The mortar was fresh and strong, applied by someone who clearly knew what they were doing and wanted the seal to last. But after nearly an hour of careful work with the crowbar, Marianne managed to create enough leverage to lift the first stone. Beneath it was darkness, pure, absolute darkness that seemed to absorb her flashlight beam rather than reflect it. She removed 3 more stones, revealing what lay below. Stone steps, descending into the earth at a steep angle. The stairs were old, much older than the church itself, carved directly into bedrock with tool marks that looked nothing like modern construction. Each step was worn smooth in the center from countless feet passing over them across centuries. Marianne took a deep breath, aimed her flashlight downward, and began to descend. She counted each step carefully. 10, 20, 30, 40. At 43 steps, her feet found level ground and she found herself standing at the entrance to something that took her breath away. A tunnel stretched before her into absolute darkness, and even with her powerful flashlight, she couldn't see the end of it. This wasn't a basement. This wasn't a cellar or a crawl space or any kind of normal underground structure beneath a church. This was a carefully constructed passageway that extended far beyond the footprint of the building above. The walls were mortared stone, fitted together with such precision that she could barely see the seams. The ceiling formed a perfect barrel vault that spoke of sophisticated engineering knowledge. And most remarkably, despite being underground for what must have been centuries, the air was fresh and cool, suggesting ventilation shafts somewhere in the darkness. This was old. Very, very old. Marianne began walking forward, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Every 20 feet or so, she noticed alcoves carved into the walls, niches that might have once held torches or oil lamps or religious statuary. Some were empty. Others contained remnants of what looked like iron brackets or holders, so rusted and deteriorated that they crumbled when she touched them. After roughly 200 feet, she'd been counting her paces, a habit from her property surveying days. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber about 30 feet in diameter. And in the center of that chamber, set into the far wall, stood a door that made Marianne's heart stop. It wasn't a modern door. It was a massive iron barrier, easily 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, set into the stone wall and secured with a locking mechanism that looked medieval in design. Heavy iron bands reinforced the door's structure, and a complex system of bolts and bars suggested this thing had been built to keep something either in or out. But it was what covered the door that truly captured Marianne's attention. Every single inch of the iron surface was covered with symbols, carved warnings in multiple languages, religious iconography, protective sigils, and what looked like prayers or incantations. She recognized Latin and French, but there were others she couldn't identify. Hebrew, maybe, Greek, something that looked vaguely Celtic or Nordic. And around the entire perimeter of the door, repeated over and over in Latin, was a single phrase carved so deeply into the iron that each letter was a full inch deep. Quod hic iacet, maniat in tenebris aeternum. Marianne's Latin was rusty, but she could translate the essential meaning. What lies here must remain in darkness forever. Her phone buzzed suddenly in her pocket, the vibration startlingly loud in the absolute silence of the chamber. She pulled it out with shaking hands. A text message from an unknown number. You need to get out of there. Right now. They know you've found it. Before Marianne could even think about responding, before she could process what the message meant, She heard something that made her blood run cold and every primitive survival instinct scream at her to run. Footsteps in the tunnel behind her. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving fast, the sound echoing and multiplying in the confined space until it was impossible to tell how many people were approaching. Someone had followed her down into the darkness. And judging by the sound, they weren't alone. Marianne looked desperately around the chamber, her flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness as she searched for another exit, another tunnel, any way out besides the way she'd come. There was nothing, just the iron door in front of her and the tunnel behind her where the footsteps were getting closer, closer, the sound now accompanied by voices, low, urgent voices speaking in tones she couldn't quite make out. She was trapped in a stone chamber hundreds of feet underground, with an ancient door sealed with warnings in 6 languages in front of her, and unknown pursuers closing in from behind. The flashlight beams appeared in the tunnel entrance, at least 3 separate lights cutting through the darkness. Marianne pressed herself against the wall beside the iron door, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She turned off her own flashlight, plunging herself into total darkness, hoping they might pass by, might not see her in the shadows. The footsteps stopped at the chamber entrance. "She's here," a woman's voice said, surprisingly calm and professional. "The fresh footprints are clear." "Ms. Delacroix," a man's voice called out, deeper and with an accent she couldn't quite place. "We know you're in there. We're not here to hurt you. We just need to talk." Marianne stayed silent, barely breathing. "My name is Dr. Helena Ashford," the woman's voice continued. "I represent a group that has been waiting a very long time for someone to legally own this property. You have something we need, Ms. Delacroix. Access. Legal access to what lies behind that door." The flashlight beams swept the chamber, and Marianne knew it was only seconds before they found her. "You bought this church for 12 cents, the man's voice said. "Don't you want to know why? Don't you want to know what you actually purchased?" Marianne took a deep breath and turned her flashlight back on, pointing it at the tunnel entrance. 3 figures stood there, silhouetted against their own lights. As they stepped into the chamber, Marianne got her first clear look at them. The woman who'd called herself Dr. Ashford appeared to be in her 50s, dressed in practical exploration gear, cargo pants, hiking boots, a jacket with multiple pockets. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she carried what looked like professional surveying equipment. The man with the accented voice was younger, maybe 40, with dark hair and intense eyes. He wore similar gear and carried a leather bag that suggested specialized equipment. But it was the third person who truly shocked Marianne. Dr. Constance Whitmore stood there, looking older and more tired than she had just hours earlier at the Historical Society, but very much present and clearly part of whatever this was. "You," Marianne said, anger replacing fear. "You warned me away. You told me to sell and forget about this place." Dr. Whitmore's expression was sad but determined. I had to give you the chance to walk away. But I knew you wouldn't. You're too curious, too brave, too stubborn. Just like Sister Evangeline was." "What is this?" Marianne demanded. "What's going on?" Dr. Helena Ashford stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Ms. Delacroix, what would you say if I told you that door behind you has been sealed for over 300 years? That what lies beyond it could rewrite American colonial history and expose secrets that some of the most powerful families in New England have been hiding since before the United States existed?" Marianne looked from one face to another, her mind racing. "I'd say you're insane." "Then let me show you something," the man with the accent said. He pulled a document from his leather bag, old parchment, carefully preserved in a clear protective sleeve. "My name is Dr. Marcus Thorne. I'm a historian specializing in pre-colonial North American archaeology. This document is from 1741, written by a Jesuit missionary named Father Jean-Baptiste Moreau, Sister Evangeline's ancestor, as it happens." He handed the document to Marianne carefully. Even through the protective sleeve, she could see the elegant handwriting, the official seals, the age of the parchment. Marianne agreed to help the historians open the vault. Inside, they found Father Moreau's complete records, treaties, land deeds, and evidence proving New England's founding families built their wealth on genocide and fraud. As they documented everything, powerful family representatives arrived, led by Victoria Thornton Ashford. She offered Marianne $5 million for silence. Marianne refused, revealing she'd already backed up everything to the cloud and sent it to news organizations. Realizing the truth was out, Victoria agreed to cooperate with reparations. 3 months later, the story broke worldwide. Marianne transformed the church into a historical truth center, giving voice to the silenced and proving courage matters more than money.